Hi, this is Jurgen Rasmussen. Welcome to the Provocative Hypnosis Vlog. When I speak to clients and when I speak to therapists and coaches alike, they very often operate within the frame of let's solve your problem. Let's solve your problem and let's find some solutions. And I'm not saying that that's wrong. I'm just going to offer a different frame. And it's a frame that I picked up from the developmental psychologist Robert Kagan. And he's often said, look for a good problem to solve you. So don't solve the problem. Look for a good problem to solve you. Now, many times this might sound nonsensical. What does it mean to look for a good problem to solve you versus solving a problem? And what's the problem with solving a problem? Well, there's always something to lose. So if you solve a problem, you've lost a problem. Now, how is that a problem, you might ask? Well, if you view all perceived problems, and this is another nice definition I got from a psychologist called George Pransky. He often used to say that if you have a situation and an insecure mindset, you have the perception of a problem. So if you view all perceived problems as bugs in the system, well, what you might preserve then is the system. And might it be that the very system itself is what generates many of these perceived problems to begin with? So if you solve a problem quickly, you might very often guarantee that you walk out of there the exact same person, so to speak. So here's the proposition. Sometimes, and I'm not suggesting to always do this or that you have to do this, I'm just offering this as a frame. Sometimes what we view as a conflict might be that you've overly identified with one end of a polarity and that someone else seems to hold the other end of the polarity for you. And instead of viewing it as the problem is out there with the other person, or even the approach of let me try to understand the other person's problem and enter into his or her world in an attempt to understand, what if instead you could view it as an invitation to see if you could find more of what the other person seems to hold in yourself? And in that case, you could solve you, meaning your sense of self could get bigger, could be more encompassing, so to speak. So I'll give you a couple of examples from my client practice. I had a client once who came in her 30s in a relationship. She and her husband very much wanted to have kids. This was a well educated, smart woman who was very much into genetics and believed to a large extent that personality was largely determined by genetics. And she told me that her grandfather had been a cold blooded psychopath. He had raped, he had been violent, committed fraud, he had done all the things that seemed to belong in the category of someone being highly psychopathic. And her father had had many of the tendencies as well. And she was concerned that, you know, in having kids, that might get passed on with the kid genetically. Now, I'm not really in a position to say to what extent that's a reasonable or valid concern, but what I noticed was that she seemed to identify herself very strongly with the seemingly opposite qualities of those she attributed to her grandfather. So her grandfather was psychopathic, manipulative, exploitative, violent. He was kind, good hearted, a decent human being, loving, compassionate. So, what I had her do in her imagination was I had her imagine her grandfather and I had her begin to tell him off by, using utterances such as "you're a violent person," "you're exploitative," "you're manipulative." So, and what I then had her do was I would have her apply the self, meaning to turn all these statements around. So going from "you're violent" to "I'm violent," right? And she immediately protested. But what happened was that she spontaneously went into a memory where she had slapped her husband and spit at him. So before she could protest too much, I had her own that. I had her really step into that, embody that, and own it as her own violence, and to view her grandfather from the perspective of owning her own violent tendencies. And we just went through the list. You're manipulative. So I had her apply to self and begin to find how she was manipulating in her own life. And one of the things that she eventually saw was that she saw that she was using the prototype of her grandfather and her father in labeling them and attributing them as psychopaths in a way that reinforced her own notions of herself as a good and decent human being. And she was able to see how manipulative that was in a sense. And what happened was that she was able to discover and own all the qualities that she attributed to her grandfather in herself. She ended up saying, "Oh my God, it's me. My grandfather is me. These are these are all my qualities." She had a huge relief. And then the challenge became to see if she could find some of the qualities that she had attributed to herself in her grandfather. And she kind of reluctantly remembered that he had saved a kid from drowning once, and also a few other instances of behaviors that pretty much everyone would characterize as brave, courageous, and good. And the end result, she was blissful for weeks after this. It was a profound intervention. Um, and it really changed how she viewed herself. Now, the the term psychopath, or perhaps more accurately, a person who scores high on psychopathic traits, may still be relevant or useful in terms of her grandfather. None of this really implies um, or says anything about to what extent she should have contact with him or on what terms she should have a relationship. But but this was a case psychologically where what looked like an external conflict was also an invitation to solve her, for her to find in herself more of the qualities that she attributed to her grandfather, and as a result, to be able to grow and to evolve as a human being. Whenever I very often joke with clients and I call them Nazis. And it's kind of tongue in cheek. It's a joke, but it's not completely a joke. calling them Nazis in a metaphorical sense, because we very often use language to create distinctions and polar opposites that aren't necessarily inherently there at the level of experience. They're at least somewhat created through language. So we might create a distinction between strength and vulnerability, for example, where it looks as if strength is one thing and vulnerability is something else entirely. And if I'm overly identified with strength, then vulnerability out there in other people might seem to be uh, pissing me off or irritating me, in a sense. But in this case, could I find the strength in the vulnerability? Or could I find the vulnerability in how I conceptualize or make sense of strength? So I had one client, and I know that I've mentioned this client story on a previous video. You may have seen it, you may have not. But I had a client once who was a who identified herself as a perfectionist. She would say, I am a perfectionist. And of course, what scared her more than anything was the idea of being, making mistakes. But not only making mistakes, because the fact that she acted perfectly and was in control meant that she was perfect in a sense. And thereby making a mistake kind of implied that she was a mistake. This is what I mean by the Nazi project is as soon as you identify with one part of a polarity, unconsciously you're going to project the opposite polarity out there onto other people. And you're going to do what you can very often to send those aspects of yourself to the gas chamber, metaphorically speaking, to enhance and kind of bolster your current sense of self. So, what I did with this woman was that I tasked her to make some perfect mistakes. So, I took her to a gas station, which is a place where that kind of woman would never have eaten, anyways. And I had her order a hot dog with bacon and all sorts of stuff, which was also the kind of food that, a snobbish, kind of Norwegian upper class, so to speak, woman would never eat. And I had her deal with her that she had to do whatever I told her to do. So the task was to make a perfect mistake, meaning to kind of smear her dress with the ketchup and mustard and drop it on the floor, but to make the mistake in such a way that it was perfect, that no one can spot that it was actually staged and choreographed. And then her writing task was to begin to find the mistakes in her conceptions of perfection, meaning the way you've conceptualized perfection. What are the mistakes in that way of conceptualizing? And these tasks were hugely liberating for her. And not only did it solve certain anxieties in her life, but you could say in many ways that they solved her sense of self expanded as a result of these particular interventions. Now here's something very interesting to look at as well. If you look at these sorts of polarities, if you overly identify with one end of the polarity, you'll very often um, end up undermining the very end of the polarity that you're identifying with. And all possessions include the seed to their own destruction. So, for example, if you look at some of the people who very much identify as being tolerant, as being for diversity and inclusivity, and their identity is that of being tolerant, notice very often when these folks get some power, how that very often undermines the very tolerance that they're claiming to be an expression of. It often turns into a vindictive political correctness. So, for example, if I claim to you that you should be open to anything, judge nothing, and be tolerant of everything, there's a paradox there because everything, per definition, has to include the possibility of you closing your mind to certain things. I mean, everything has to include that. Or you could look at, for example, many of the folks who have, you know, begun to see quite a bit of the subjectivity behind what we often call objective truth. So they overly identify often with the subjective and downplay the objective. And they may very often see that our experience is very much a construction, right? But in leaning too hard on it, they sometimes begin to say stuff like, "Well, there is no truth. There are no truths." So they end up becoming these absolute relativists, right? Where it's a paradox, where it's like there is no truth except for the truth that there is no truth. No culture or no position is better than any other position, except for the universal claim that relativizing is better than saying that one position is more evolved than another position. But it very often ends up uh, paradoxical. I'm reading a book at the moment that I'm really enjoying. It's called Cured by a guy called Dr. Jeffrey Rediger. I highly recommend it if you're into change work or health. It's about the science of what's called spontaneous remission. So, Dr. Rediger has spent the last 17 years studying people who have had remissions from what was supposed to be terminal cancer, lupus, cystic fibrosis, severe cases of arthritis, multiple sclerosis, uh, medical miracles. And he talks about initially getting into it, how skeptical he was, how reluctant he was, and how scared he was of not being scientific, and how many in the medical community would kind of shun anyone who looked into that stuff as being anti-scientific. Um, so here you kind of have the polarity between science on the one hand and woo-woo, so to speak, on the other hand. And what he's been able to do over the last 17 years in studying, hundreds of these cases is to begin to kind of explore the what you call science of spontaneous remissions, finding the science in what seemed to be woo-woo, right? And also finding some of the woo-woo in what seemed to be established science. The mind-body split, the extreme materialist taken for granted position that most of medicine seems to operate by. I'll leave you with a little quote I got from Richard Bandler once, who was asked how he could recommend books on science and fairy tales, somewhat equally. And he said, look, um, there's a lot of truth in fairy tales, and there's a lot of fairy tales in what we currently think of as scientific findings or evidence. And as the years go by, m- many of the claims in the fairy tales seem to become as true, more true, and more of the scientific findings seem to move in the direction of fairy tales. So I'll leave you with that. Um, if you found this useful or inspiring, or you have any objections, feel free to leave them wherever you find this particular video. If my way of thinking resonates with you and you're looking to make some changes in your life, or you're looking for mentoring, you can get in touch with me at provocativehypnosis.com. Hope this was useful.